The year is 1919. The war had just ended, and people in America were looking for something to do. Meanwhile, in Wisconsin, George Calhoun and Curly Lambeau, both having played high school football years prior, happened to run into each other one day and got to talking. Lambeau mentioned how he went on to play college football at Notre Dame, but had to drop out due to a severe case of tonsillitis. During the conversation, he mentioned how he still wanted to play. Calhoun then said, "Well, what if we start a football team?" Lambeau loved the idea. Later on, he would persuade his employer, the Indian Packing Company, to sponsor the team. They would put down $500 for equipment and uniforms. Lambeau wanted to call the team the Green Bay Indians to show respect to his employer for purchasing the uniforms for the team. That's when his girlfriend said, "Why don't you just call them the Green Bay Packers?" From that moment on, it was official. The legacy was born. American football has such a compelling story. When this happened, the NFL didn't exist yet. In fact, pro football at the time was just sort of local clubs getting together and having a little scrimmage. Here's a pretty crazy story. When the Packers started playing games, they didn't have a fence around the field, so they didn't charge admission. Instead, they would pass around a hat amongst the crowd, kind of like what a church would do. The players on the team would split the pot after the season. They each made $16.50. It wasn't until the following year, 1920, when the NFL would officially become a thing. The first recognized NFL game ever took place on October 3rd, 1920 in Dayton, Ohio. It was witnessed by 4,000 people who each paid $1.75 to attend the game. It was pretty low-key. There's no footage that I'm aware of, and hardly any photos. Also, it was played between two teams who didn't exist by the 1930s. Pro football had humble beginnings. Like I said, it had existed for quite some time before that. Plus, the game had been around at the collegiate level for even longer. This made me wonder, how did this sport even begin? And when was the first official game of football ever played? Before we dive in, this video is brought to you by SeatGeek. As always, use promo code KTO at checkout for $20 off your first purchase. They also just launched the Daily Tap, where they are giving away thousands of dollars in tickets and discounts a week to events like the Jonas Brothers, Post Malone, and more. It's completely free. You can enter every day, and it's as easy as tapping a button in the app to enter. You're basically giving away the chance to win free tickets by not entering every day. So download the app, use code KTO for $20 off, and don't forget to enter the Daily Tap. Shout out to SeatGeek for the sponsor. Now back to the video. Quick history lesson. The first traces go all the way back to ancient Greece and Rome. Some of their games, like Feininda or Harpastum, featured a leather ball filled with wool that involved a great deal of strength and agility. With tackling and sporadic sprinting, broken bones happened all the time. From this then came a medieval game called Mob Ball. Rules varied from town to town, but usually there seemed to be hardly any rules, just a ball and violence. Over the course of time, clubs began to develop in Europe, and people started playing all forms of mob ball, some more civilized than others. Eventually, there was order brought to this game. During a set of meetings in London in 1863, a committee was put in place to create an official set of rules to give some sort of regulation. From these meetings, two games were created: a more physical game that used your hands, and a more skillful game that used your feet. Both of these games had been established, but in America, it was a different story. By the 19th century, Americans had been sort of playing by their own rules depending on which college campus you were at. Towards the end of the 1860s, the Civil War had ended, and universities began to experiment with making official rules. Now, the next thing I'm going to say will answer the question of this video. In my mind, it's both right and wrong. On November 6, 1869, Rutgers and Princeton, based on the rules that Princeton had created 2 years prior, would compete in what has become known as the first college football game ever played. The NCAA recognizes this as true, and Rutgers has a statue that says it's the birthplace of college football. This is a fact, but you wouldn't recognize it. You couldn't pick up the ball. Scoring involved kicking the ball, and the two teams each had 25 players on the field. Does that sound like the football we know and love? Not really. However, it was a starting point for standardizing football. Now, this brings up another question. When would football become recognizable to us? 1874, Harvard would play against Canadian University McGill. McGill had agreed to come to Boston if they would play by their Canadian rules. It was an emphasis on rugby. Harvard took a liking to this. They would challenge Yale to a game a year later, and even though Yale would lose, they were captivated by rugby. They put an emphasis on learning the nuances and beat Harvard the following year. One of Yale's team members in 1876, Walter Camp, decided, hey, this is a cool game and all, but I have a few ideas that can make it better. If you're a football fan, be sure to thank this dude for what he did. He changed everything. Instead of a scrum, Camp introduced the line of scrimmage and having a center snap the ball to what he called a quarterback. Instead of unlimited downs like in rugby, you now had a set of downs. If you didn't get the ball far enough, you turned the ball over. He changed the amount of players on the field from 25 on 25 to 11 on 11, introduced proper formations, and decided touchdowns were more important than field goals. This was all in Walter Camp's official rule book beginning in 1882. If you wanted a year that football became recognizable, that is it. By the age of 33, Camp had become known as the father of American football. By the time he passed away in 1925, the game had evolved into a professional sport that had swept the nation. A game that he probably had no idea how big it would become.
Pass is intercepted at the goal line by Malcolm Butler.